Good morning, dear friends. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here again. I'm sure that your discussions and the exchange of ideas yesterday were very heated. And of course, we're all looking forward to tomorrow, when the winners will present the ideas that have won the support of the entire audience gathered here in Moscow these past few days. The president said in his speech that the world is changing fundamentally. And indeed, the world around us is, on the one hand, a world of numerous challenges, but most importantly, it is a world of vast opportunities. Opportunities that we, together with all of you and people from across the globe, will seize the implementing various projects to make our lives better. In my remarks today, I would like to talk about these global trends. In my view, there are three such fundamental themes. The first relates to the changing global geo-economics landscape, and the second concerns major shifts in demography. And the third trend is technological. These are the three trends I'd like to discuss today, focusing on the opportunities they create for people. And what kind of world will we be living in? I would like to start with the geoeconomic trends. The world is indeed changing. As Chairman Xi said, the changes that are occurring are something we haven't seen in a century. But I want to begin with how the global economy itself is changing. Here on this chart, you can see the structure of the world economy. Now, let's look at the dynamics of how it has changed over the past few decades. This is the structure of the global economy in 1980. At that time, the G7 countries accounted for 45% of the total, and the G7 nations dominated the top 5, holding the first, second, third and fourth positions. The world has changed since then, as new leaders have begun to replace the old ones. And what we see right now is that the BRICS countries are starting to really take over in terms of global GDP. They now make up about 40% of the world's economy. And as for the top 5, while it was once 4 countries from the G7, today China firmly holds the top spot. India is number 3, and Russia is number 4. In other words, 3 of the 5 leading economies are now from the BRICS group. Moreover, countries like Indonesia and Brazil are gradually gaining momentum and moving up this list. Therefore, the structure of the global economy has changed. It has changed radically, and will continue to do so. We will talk more about this later today. But this geoeconomic shift lies at the heart of many trends. The countries that used to dominate and define the platform for global growth are now playing a lesser role and losing their dominance. And the significant volatility we're seeing in the global political landscape is directly linked to this loss of control. The economy is changing, trade flows are changing, and the interconnectedness of global economies is changing. Trade is shifting away from routes through the global north towards direct trade between countries of the global south. The new leaders of the global economy are increasingly trading directly among themselves and establishing direct economic ties. This in turn indicates that new logistic routes are developing, and direct connectivity boosts the efficiency of such trade and relationships. And all of this is shaping the future of our world. It's not just the trade landscape that is changing, but the technological landscape as well. This chart on this slide shows a ranking based on the number of publications in a Dimensions scientific database, which is English language database. And even there, we see that the BRICS countries are also starting to take the lead in terms of technology. And as a natural result, This is driving them to build their own tech platforms and products, the very foundations of the future economy. China is leading the pack here, with India moving up to third place and Russia at number 8. Contrast that with the G7 countries. Just 20 or 30 years ago, they completely dominated the global tech landscape. Now they are in a steady decline in this arena. So, that covers the structure of the global economy. Now, let's move on to the next slide, which is about birth rates. After all, population size is one of the most powerful forces that will shape the global economy of the future. Let's look at the year 1980. Even back then, the G7 countries accounted for just 14% of global births. This demographic trend is a huge part of the story behind the economic shifts we're seeing today. On the chart, you can see how the structure of births has changed across the globe, country by country. And what's really interesting is that we're already seeing the next wave of rising countries coming up right behind the BRICS nations. And when we look ahead, we see the next wave of players. Countries in Africa, like Nigeria and Congo, alongside Pakistan. These are the nations set to play an increasingly crucial role, the ones that will shape the trajectory of the global economy, especially as we move into the second half of the 21st century. Now, here's another critical point, and we'll dive into this more later. Back in the 1980s, India and China had very similar birth rates, well over 20 million babies a year each. But look at China now. In recent years, its annual births have plummeted to just 8 million. In fact, looking at the 2025 figures, Nigeria has already caught up with China in the number of births, and Pakistan is right on their heels. This is a truly fundamental shift in demographic trends. For decades, the conversation was always about China being the most populous nation and the world's largest economy in terms of people. But that's no longer the case. It has already lost that top spot to India. On top of that, China's population is now in rapid decline, with its total fertility rate dropping below 1. We'll touch on these demographic trends again later, but for now, let's move on. This next slide is a great illustration of China's journey over the past 30 years. So, what can we see here? This slide lays it out clearly. The horizontal axis shows the level of economic development. That's GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. The vertical axis represents the urban population share. And what you see is the incredible path China has taken in just 3 decades, a massive process of urbanization combined with a huge leap in its economic efficiency and overall development. And we see India is on a very similar journey, just trailing China by about 10 to 15 years. You can see how these countries are tracing the same path on this graph, moving from the bottom left corner up to the top right. For massive economies like China and India, this journey of development means enormous global economic growth. China was without a doubt the primary engine of global growth in the first quarter of the 21st century. Now the baton is being passed to India and the nations of South Asia. And after them, another wave of leaders will emerge. So you see, these waves of economic growth are constantly shifting. If we plot every country in the world on this same chart, we get a clear picture of the global landscape and its development. In the top right corner, you have the highly developed nations, the US, the EU, Russia and Japan. These are countries that completed their main phase of urbanization long ago and have achieved high levels of economic prosperity. Then you see the nations that powered through the early 21st century, China and Southeast Asia, which have already climbed significantly, reaching high levels of both development and urbanization. Think about China. During its 30-year journey, its urbanization level skyrocketed from 30% to nearly 70%. It effectively became the epicenter of global urban development, construction, and infrastructure. We saw brand new cities literally springing up out of nowhere. We now see modern megacities of 10-20 million people. This is all a direct result of the massive urbanization process, a path that other economies are now beginning to embark on. And this chart gives us a clear glimpse into which countries are poised to play a pivotal role in the decades to come. We're looking at countries in South Asia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. We see nations of the African continent, like Egypt. And we see the second wave of Southeast Asian economies, Indonesia and Vietnam. For the next few decades, these nations will be the very heart of global economic growth, driving the world economy forward. And after them, the next wave will emerge with countries like Ethiopia, Congo, and others in Africa. This is the wave that will play a major role in economic development in the second half of the 21st century. Now, the size of each circle here represents the number of births, a crucial metric, as it determines the future scale of a nation's economy and population. And as you can see, and I'll say it again, the circles of Nigeria and China are already the same size. In terms of new births, they are now on par. Meanwhile, India continues to have over 20 million births annually. Moving on. Let's now talk about another factor that's contributing to the declining role of the G7 economies in global development. And that, of course, in their fiscal and debt crisis. What this really signifies is that they've hit a development ceiling using their traditional financial playbook. Just look at what's happening in the G7 countries. Over the last 20 years alone, the public debt has surged from 80% of GDP to 130%. We're seeing a systemic rise in budget deficits. Back in the early 2000s, a deficit of 2-4% was considered normal. Today, the new standard is closer to 6%. Now, demographic trends and rising interest in payments are certainly major factors. But the bottom line is this. One of the very pillars of the Western economy, its financial system, is breaking down. The mechanism that once fueled so much economic growth is no longer working. And this isn't just a problem for these economies. It's a problem for the entire global economy. Why? Because the waves of growth we saw in the late 20th and early 21st centuries were largely built on the investment activity and financial tools of that very Western system. And here's another critical fact. The Western financial system is becoming increasingly expensive for the rest of the world. 15 years ago, the global costs of the US financial sector accounted for about 1.3% of global GDP. Today, that number is over 2%. This unwieldy Western financial machine is becoming more voracious and less efficient. It introduces significant risks and inefficiencies, and it has ceased to be the effective mechanism for circulating capital that it once was. The Western financial system is now giving way to the rapidly growing financial sectors of the BRICS nations. And of course, we're also seeing the rise of decentralized currency systems. I'm sure you all remember this photo, but let me remind you, this was just a few years ago, in 2021. The ever-given tanker blocking the Suez Canal. Back then, this was considered the biggest threat to global trade, a massive problem for the global economy. Everyone feared that this single event would pull the rug out from under global economic development. But it's clear, now that the challenges we face today make that incident pale in comparison. Take a look at this chart. The lighter line here is the so-called uncertainty index. You can see how dramatically uncertainty has spiked compared to the levels we got used to over the past few decades. And as I said, the root cause of this uncertainty is the tectonic shift happening in the global economy, a fundamental change in the balance of power. As the old leaders and their toolkits fades, they are being replaced by new ones. Naturally, in this environment, the old powers are scrambling to hold on to their sleeping dominance. And one of their primary tools, as you can see from the direct correlation here, is sanctions. The number of active sanctions imposed by Western economies is a key driver of uncertainty we see in the world today. So, are these sanctions having an impact? Well, Russia provides a clear case study. This chart shows our country's foreign trade and the currencies it was settled in. As you can see, back in 2021, over 3/4 of the Russian Federation's entire foreign trade was denominated in the currencies of G7 countries. In 2022, Western nations, in an attempt to exert pressure on our country, imposed sweeping sanctions on our financial sector. They banned Visa and MasterCard from operating here. They made a series of moves, all in the hope that these decisions would inflict serious economic damage. But in reality, the effect was the opposite. Russia simply stopped paying for expensive Western financial services and developed its own mechanisms instead. The West hoped that sanctions would cripple our foreign trade. But as this chart clearly shows, our trade volume today is roughly the same level as it was in 2020-2021. These fluctuations are largely driven by commodity price dynamics, which affect our trade volumes. But there's the crucial part. If you look at the chart for 2025, you see a completely different picture. 85% of our foreign trade is now settled in either Russian rubles or the currencies of the BRICS nations. The currencies of the G7 nations have been almost entirely squeezed out of our economy's financial flows. And frankly, this is the future that awaits all G7 currencies. Russia's case is simply a preview. It's showing ahead of schedule the changes that are already underway globally and will continue to unfold. As I mentioned, beyond BRICS currencies, cryptocurrencies and new decentralized tools are also starting to play a major role. Blockchain has enabled the creation of a toolkit where the influence of any single nation is extremely limited. This has de facto allowed for a financial system that is independent of national sovereignty. And we see its role steadily growing. The events of 2022, the sanctions, the pressure from the West, shattered trust in the Western financial system. They expose its unreliability and vulnerability, which in turn became another catalyst for the gradual growth of the crypto market. And now for my final point, which is also incredibly important. It's a development from the past decade that can't be overstated. The rise and growing influence of platforms that connect vast numbers of users across borders. Just look at the largest global platforms. They have billions of users, surpassing the population of even the largest nations. You can see India, China, and then where the biggest digital platforms rank. This is another factor that is beginning to play a crucial role in shaping the information landscape. In fact, social media has played, and continues to play, a significant role in polarizing societies, laying the groundwork for conflict, and even negatively impacting birth rates, alongside and positive contributions they make. So we can't ignore this factor in our analysis. I won't go into detail on that today, but the emergence of these platforms is, of course, a critical piece of new global picture. Now, let's move on. So what's the bottom line? The world is changing. It is changing inevitably. And this change is driven by a fundamental, structural shift in the global economy. We are seeing the hubs of not just economic growth, of overall economic activity shift to the BRICS nations. We understand that this process is irreversible. Technology, finance, trade, all of it will become increasingly tied to the BRICS countries. And this will unlock tremendous opportunities for their people, who represent the vast majority of the global population. The development of these economies, the growing connectivity, and the new technological solutions that will emerge from them, that is the blueprint for the future. On this slide, we have schematically laid out our vision for the world model, based on how different countries interact in the modern era. I will now discuss this in more detail. At the very heart of this new model is a single crucial factor – sovereignty. We are witnessing a global race for sovereignty, which is causing four poles of sovereignty. To emerge, spanning the economic, social and state domains. These poles are US, China, Russia and India. Now, you'll notice I have deliberately not drawn the European Union as a separate role. This is because the EU largely lacks genuine sovereignty. It remains heavily dependent on the United States, particularly for its state sovereignty. The US also exerts significant influence over the EU's socio-economic sovereignty, which is why I've replace the EU right next to the US on this diagram. Now, what else is important here? While we used to talk about unipolar world, we are now seeing a clear trend towards multipolarity. And what's critical is that, besides these poles of sovereignty, there are other major players on this map, centers of economic growth. These are economies that already play a significant role on the global stage, but do not yet possess a sufficient level of their own sovereignty. In this multipolar world, connected countries are also beginning to play a major role. Examples of this would be countries like Singapore or the United Arab Emirates. Those countries that are small, with small populations and economies, play a very important role in this new world, with its centers of sovereignty and separate, fast-growing economies. They help to bind this entire picture into a single whole. As I've said, sovereignty is becoming the most important factor. We can identify three levels of sovereignty: state, social and socio-economic. The first level, state sovereignty, determines the very existence of the nation, its to be or not to be. The second, social sovereignty, defines the nation's identity through its values, cultural code and history. And the third, socio-economic sovereignty, addresses the how, the economic platform for meeting people's needs for everything from food and mobility to emotional well-being. And what's critical to understand is that these three levels are deeply intertwined. You cannot achieve state sovereignty without also securing social and socio-economic sovereignty. To achieve genuine national sovereignty, a country must attain a sufficient level of control on all three of these levels. At the same time, it's also important to remember, and our president has spoken about this, that no country can be completely sovereign in a vacuum. It will always be interconnected with its partners and depend on interaction with other countries. Therefore, truly sovereignty is achieved through a balanced approach. When a country possesses its own core competences and cultural identity, while also being actively engaged in cooperation with other nations. So the world that we see, the one that has already taken shape and in which we will live for the coming decades, it's a multipolar world with several centers of sovereignty. This concept and the global race for sovereignty is the first critical trend. Now let's move on. The second major trend that is already profoundly changing our global society is, of course, demographic crisis. I'm being deliberately provocative with my language here, because the reality is that the new global landscape is taking shape, and people have not yet fully grasped the gravity of these trends. In essence, we are approaching peak global population. The reality is, the factors that will cause this peak to happen soon and for the population to then decline are already locked in. If we look at the total fertility rate, TFR, it has been steadily declining for the last century. But the key point is that in the recent years, the global TFR has dropped below the replacement level. In other words, the number of births worldwide is no longer sufficient to even keep the population stable. The groundwork for a gradual shift to population decline has already been laid. The second trend, which partially offset low fertility for a time, is the rise in life expectancy. We can see how it has increased steadily since the 1950s, reaching remarkable levels. People are living longer, and even with lower birth rates, this contributed to population growth. However, this also drives another demographic trend, an aging population and an increase in the proportion of the post-working age population globally. Now look at how population dynamics have been projected. The orange line represents the forecast the United Nations made just 10 years ago. It did not predict that the global population would peak in the 21st century. Instead, it projected continued growth up to 11 billion people. In contrast, the median forecast from 2024 now states that the peak will occur in 2085. The UN also noted that under its low variance scenario, the peak could be reached as early as 2055. But if you look closely at the data that wasn't included in the UN forecast and scrutinize the models they used, you find something strange. For reasons that are unclear, UN experts are modeling a sharp reversal of the declining fertility trend, rather than projecting a continuation of the very stable trends we have observed in virtually every country over the past few decades. Now, if you incorporate all the established trends and the latest data into these forecasts, the peak is more likely to be 2046, not 2055, followed by a decline in the global population. At the same time, what's known as the demographic dependency ratio will hit its lowest point in 2033. This is the ratio of children and the elderly to the working age population. From that point on, this dependency ratio will start to rise. It's true that in recent years the dependency ratio has been falling, and that was a direct result of the sharp decline in the number of children, as we can see from the rapid drop in the green line here. But going forward, the number of children will fall to such a low level that further declines in fertility will no longer be able to lower the dependency ratio. Instead, the ratio will begin to rise rapidly, driven by the growing share of the elderly population. Now for the next chart. I'm going to set it in motion. This is the age structure of the world's population in 1950. I'd like to draw your attention to these specific figures. As I play this animation, what should you look for? First, the share of the elderly. In 1950, they made up just 5% of the population. The ratio of the elderly to the working age population was tiny: 6% in Africa, 7% in Asia, and 8% in the rest of the world. So you had a huge working age population, around 60%, and a large proportion of children. That forms the base for the future growth of the working age population. That's 35%. So what you see here is a classic population pyramid. Okay, let's see in motion and see what has already happened and what will happen in the 21st century. We can see the pyramid gradually changing. The share of the working-age population peaked sometime around now, at about 63–64%, and from this point on, it will decline. Meanwhile, the share of the elderly is rising sharply, right? See how the structure has changed. By the end of the century in Asia, the ratio of the elderly to the working-age population will no longer be the 7% it once was. It will be 77%. This means there will be roughly one elderly person for every person in the workforce. At the same time, as you can see, the population structure is also changing dramatically by continent. Africa, which used to be a small fraction, will come to dominate the youth and working-age populations. Meanwhile, the elderly population, as I mentioned, will be concentrated mainly in Asian countries. So, essentially, the world at the end of the 21st century will be a world of young Africans and elderly Asians. In my view, the changes happening in Asia are particularly significant and must be taken into account. This next chart deals with population. Here in China, we see the number of births per 1,000 people. Now, if we look at the trend in the total number of births, we see that drop to 8 million we talked about earlier. But you can clearly see the sharp downward trend in the number of births continue. From the peaks we saw in the 1970s and 80s, we fall into much lower levels. What does this mean for China's population? And using China as an example, I'll try to break down what these demographic shifts mean for the entire world. Here's how China's population has changed since the 1980s and how it will continue to change by the end of the 21st century. In 1980s, China's population was about 1 billion people, with 800 million being rural, while the urban population was around 200 million. The population grew steadily, fueled by the high birth rates of the 1970s and 80s. At the same time, life expectancy was also actively growing. All this led to China's population peak being reached around 2020 at 1.4 billion people. And now China has entered a phase of overall population decline with every year. Yes, last year the actual population of China shrank by more than 3 million people, with deaths outnumbering births. What else is important here? We see the trend of urbanization. The share of the urban population grew sharply, and the urban population, the population of China's cities. Again, if it was 200 million people in 1980s, today it's around 900 million. This very trend is what lies behind all those magnificent cities that were built in China. My favorite example is the city of Shenzhen, which is located across from Hong Kong. In 1979, at the start of this graph, Shenzhen was basically a single street, a fishing village with nothing in it. Today, Shenzhen is a beautiful city with a modern architecture, and more than 15 million people live here. The city of Shenzhen, as well as many other Chinese cities, it's a very direct reflection of these trends of rapid urban population growth. But what's very important in that the sharp drop in the birth rate we've seen in China will dictate the country's population decline. It will also dictate a decline in the urban population. Yes, urbanization will continue to grow gradually for a little while longer. But in any case, somewhere around 2030, 2035, that is, it's just 5 to 10 years, China will pass its peak urban population. And by the end of the 21st century, given the sharp overall population decline, half of China's city will simply no longer be needed. Half of China's cities will be empty. This is, in fact, a vivid example of where the world as a whole is heading. And if we look in the individual regions of China today, we can see this trend manifesting clearly. What do I mean by that? For example, if you take Heilongjiang province in northeast China, it's the province currently experiences the fastest rate of depopulation. Well, at its peak, it had around 40 million residents. That figure has now dropped for 30 million. That means a quarter of Heilongjiang's population has essentially been lost. The one place that is still actively developing is the city of Harbin, with about 10 million residents and a more or less stable population. But the rest of the province is undergoing this serious trend of depopulation, and gradually this situation will affect all of China and all of Southeast Asia. It will lead to changes, to tectonic shifts in the economy. What does this mean? It means that if your population isn't growing but shrinking, you no longer have a housing shortage. You no longer need to build and develop infrastructure at the same pace as before. This means your demand for commodities will decrease. We are already seeing the impact on things like demand for education, given this sharp drop in the birth rates. Just think about it. In 2016-2017, about 17 to 18 million children were born in China. Last year, 8 million children were born in China. Less than half that number. The demand for early childhood education infrastructure has been falling dramatically. The number of empty kindergartens in China is growing exponentially. Therefore, the changes set in motion by this transition from global population growth to decline, combined with a structural shift toward an older population, are, I'll say it again, truly fundamental in nature. We need to be ready for them and prepared to build the economy of the future, the 21st century economy, which will be radically different from what we have today. This is the kind of reversal we will see in the population pyramid. In China in 1980, the ratio was 12 working-age people for every one elderly person. In a society like that, you might not even need a pension system, because there are always enough children to support their parents who can no longer work. But if current trends continue, it will mean that for every 2 elderly people in China, there will be only one person of working age. This is a very important indicator. In fact, similar trends, though milder, will occur all over the world. And this, for example, raises a critical question about the sustainability of pension system and providing for the elderly. What do I mean by that? No matter what kind of pension system you have, whether it's a pay-as-you-go system, where you collect taxes today to make transfers to the elderly, or a funded system where you have a financial market, financial assets, and real estate investments that ensure you a comfortable retirement. All of this based on one simple premise. You have a sufficient number of working-age people who generate output. And you can claim a share of that output through various instruments. If you have a very low share of working-age population, then the amount of available output is smaller. So what does this mean? It means you either have to collect very high taxes from the working population to support the elderly, or the threshold for when people stop working, the retirement age, needs to be raised significantly. Or the third option, all the financial instruments you've invested in, all your real estate will simply lose value, and the income from these assets won't be enough to support you in your old age. This is precisely why the People's Republic of China is now investing heavily in automation, industrial robotics, and robot development. Because there is only one way out of this situation: a sharp increase in human labor productivity through even greater automation. Here's an assessment from the European Union that shows how demographic trends, which in Europe are comparable to China's, though perhaps not as aggressive, affect the structure of government spending. In the long term, according to a projection running to the year 2070, spending on education will decrease significantly due to the large drop in the number of children. The demand falls first for kindergartens, then for schools, and then for universities and vocational institutions. At the same time, spending related to pensions, healthcare and long-term care is rising. Moreover, in European Union, we understand that state pensions don't play a significant role. Financial savings are much more important, and those savings will also rapidly lose value in this kind of development model. And of course, the pressure of budgets is growing. We see here that against an increase in social spending of 1.6 percentage points of GDP, the reduction in education spending is a mere half a percentage point of GDP. This is compounded by the already significant budget deficits in these countries and naturally leads to additional economic problems. The demographic trend is one of the major forces that will be changing in our world for decades to come. It will change the face of how we live. It will change the shape of the labor market and how economic output is redistributed. It will drive the rapid pace of automation. That is why I urge everyone to pay more attention to demographic changes and to understand just how crucial birth rates are for the future of individual nations and how important family policy is. Here in Russia, we prioritize these issues, and this focus will only grow in the future. The third trend I want to talk about is the technological one. In fact, all these trends are interconnected. I've already mentioned, for example, how social media has influenced demographics, right? One of the key factors in the decline of the total fertility rate in recent decades is the widespread adoption of social media in our lives, which reduces direct human interaction and polarizes society. This negative effect is real and has been shown in many research papers. But first, I wanted to talk about artificial intelligence. It's truly a technology that will change every sphere of our lives. In fact, these are the biggest technological changes to happen at least within the lifetime of anyone alive on the planet today. We have never seen changes of this magnitude in our history before. Moreover, the development of this technology is happening very quickly. The general technology and approaches of artificial intelligence have been known since the mid-20th century. The first book of artificial intelligence, which is considered the forerunner of all the technologies that are being developed and used today, was published back in the Soviet Union. However, these technologies only achieved rapid development in the last few decades. This is due to the advent of powerful computing capabilities that humanity simply didn't have before. The widespread adoption of artificial intelligence began with specialized AI, specifically in the field of machine learning. The cost of using machine learning became low enough to yield a positive economic effect, and these technologies gradually began to be widely adopted. But the real breakthrough happened in 2023, when the technologies of so-called generative artificial intelligence were made available to the public. And this is a development that is, in fact, only a few years old, but is already bursting into our lives and beginning to change, step by step, every business process in our economy. As the technology itself evolves, the concept of agentic AI has emerged. This is a development from the last year or so. And then there's the third stage, which we haven't reached yet, and which scientists and futurologists are currently debating. Some paint an apocalyptic picture, while others, conversely, are extremely positive. This stage is the creation of so-called artificial general intelligence, AGI, whose key distinguishing feature is the capacity for autonomous development, when new levels of capability are achieved independently without human intervention. As for generative AI, it is truly an artificial intelligence that can create, analyze, and act. And it has been trained on the entire body of knowledge that humanity has accumulated to this day, right? This means the AI knows more than any single person in the world. Yes, it has read all the books, all the scientific papers, all the available information, not just in text format, but also video and audio. It has assimilated all of this to one degree or another. And so, what generative AI is doing right now is essentially learning, step by step, how to apply the knowledge embedded with it. Indeed, control models, agent-based frameworks, and other approaches are now being developed specifically to teach the AI how to leverage the vast knowledge it possesses. Generative AI is evolving. Right now, we are going through an active phase of implementing agency, where a model is trained on a specific dataset so that individual AI agents can perform distinct functions. And by orchestrating these functions across different models, a far more effective result is achieved. That transition into a phase of physicalization is now actively underway, though it is a gradual process. This is where artificial intelligence is no longer just a text string and a means of communication, but some form of AI's entry into the physical world. This ranges from direct computer control. We see in this year's most popular tools to just that, with AI controlling a mouse and clicking buttons for a human, all the way to robots, including anthropomorphic ones that interact directly with the physical world around them. And the most significant development, we are gradually moving towards the one that will trigger the next leap in artificial intelligence. Call it an evolution or revolution. This is the transition to autonomous evolution, where models and algorithms will improve themselves through the AI's own work, without human involvement. This will lead to an explosive growth in the efficiency of these systems. For instance, look at how healthcare management models are being constructed now. Various AI agents are trained specifically for the role of a general practitioner. To first provide a general diagnosis, then agents acting as a specialist, like cardiologists or gastroenterologists, who have deeper knowledge of specific area and operate using that expertise. And finally, a head physician agent that analyzes all of this information. Models like these are already in active use, including Russia. For instance, in Moscow's healthcare system, AI services help physicians enhance diagnosis accuracy, reduce the probability of medical errors, and predictively identify health risks for individuals. Essentially, we are talking about the use of artificial intelligence platforms. We'll touch on this again later today. All of this enables a step-by-step transition towards a predictive model, a model of proactive health management rather than reactive treatment. This graph, for example, shows the growth in AI model efficiency over the last 5 years. These are different tests. Well, the top test, that's the orange line. It won that AI passed long ago, a test of encyclopedic knowledge, where it scores very highly, over 90%. No single person possesses such encyclopedic knowledge because no person in the world, unlike artificial intelligence, has read every book and every article that exists in this world. The second, more complex test is one of scientific reasoning. And as we're seeing, the 2025-2026 period has indeed marked a high level of AI performance on these tests. It has demonstrated its ability not just to use the knowledge it has learned, but also to engage in genuine scientific reasoning. In a moment, I'll say a few words about how this impacts scientific discovery and research. Now, for the final test. What is it? It's called Humanity's Last Exam. It compiles the most complex scientific problems and questions from every sphere of human knowledge. What does that mean? For instance, a question from medicine that only a handful of people, the world's top specialists, can answer. And questions like these have been gathered from the whole field of human knowledge. No single person can answer a question from another domain outside of their own narrow specialty. And yet, an artificial intelligence model is already demonstrating the ability to solve 40% of such complex questions and problems. Obviously, no human can achieve such a result on this test. At best, they can solve a single problem, and even then, we're talking about the top specialists in their respective fields. And AI models are also progressing in this area, and progressing very quickly. To give you a sense of the rate of change, if at the end of 2024, Google's Gemini 1.5 model showed a result of around 5%, the third model from the same creator is already showing a result of 35%. The time between those two data points, 1 year. That is the speed at which the quality of models, the quality of products, and the quality of results are changing. Okay, let's move on. But what's also important in that the cost of applying these models is decreasing just as rapidly. Yes, we are seeing a massive global demand for electricity and for data centers, which require gigawatts of new power. And yet, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the falling cost of specific computations, the cost of getting a single, concrete result. This reduction in unit cost is causing the demand for AI model outputs to surge, and that demand will grow exponentially, because, well, it starts with human queries. The next phase is integration into every home appliance, into robots and everything else. All of this will require vast computational resources so that models of all sizes, small, medium and large, can continuously process what's happening in the world and what needs to be done. And this, in turn, is changing the life of the average person. So, looking at this graph on the left, which at the time wasn't even fully projected out to 2026. We can see the trend of AI-generated content accelerating much faster than expected. And sure enough, in 2025, AI-generated content on the internet did surpass what was created by humans. And that trend is only accelerating. At the same time, this is happening even in a direct interaction through simple AI chatbots. This chart here shows the average time people worldwide spend communicating with ChatGPT. It has doubled from 8 to 16 minutes, while the time people spend on internet search engines is gradually decreasing. In other words, all of human attention, our very gateway to the world of knowledge, is shifting more and more towards AI models and direct interaction with them. Now this brings me back to the point about scientific knowledge. There was a major milestone in 2025. For the first time, an AI wrote a scientific paper that was accepted for a top-tier conference after undergoing blind peer review. That's right, for publication at an A-ranked conference, which is effectively a top-tier journal. An AI authored a scientific work that humans judge it to be of high quality. They recognized it is a legitimate scientific article and approved it for publication. As a result, the world of modern research is changing, and changing radically. In just a few years, a scientist who doesn't use the capabilities of artificial intelligence will be simply unimaginable. Any scientific article, any research paper, any study conducted with the assistance of artificial intelligence will yield a qualitatively new result. And what's crucial here is that the speed of which research, papers and inventions are prepared will increase. The overall number of published works will grow, and it will be impossible to keep up with the flow of information, which will be generated primarily with AI, unless you see that artificial intelligence yourself. In other words, any research, any scientific advancement will, I'll say it again, only be possible through a partnership between humans and artificial intelligence. So what's behind this massive breakthrough? Behind this massive breakthrough, of course, are gigantic sums of money. If we look at the investments volumes, and all these figures are in 2024 prices. The Manhattan Project, the effort to create nuclear technology and weapons in the United States, cost the American economy USD 80 billion. The entire Apollo program, which lasted for many years, the program to land the man on the moon, cost USD 215 billion. Investment in generative artificial intelligence in a single year exceeded $450 billion. In other words, more than twice the entire cost of the Apollo program. Humanity is pouring all of its very best resources into this technology, from its energy grid to its top specialists. Everything is concentrated in this one area. This is preciously why we're seeing such immense progress in this technology's development. In essence, by channeling its greatest minds in this way, humanity has now placed a direct bet on artificial intelligence technology as the foundation for its future development. When we discussed geoeconomics and geopolitics, we spoke about the importance of sovereignty. Well, it's just as important, for example, in the field of artificial intelligence. As I've said, all the trends are interconnected. AI is a crucial answer for improving the quality of the healthcare system, especially in an aging society. Artificial intelligence is a very important element of sovereignty. Yes, there are various elements to AI sovereignty. Developing your own models, ensuring you have your own infrastructure, data sovereignty. We'll talk about platforms and platform colonization in a moment. But if you see a third-party country's solution, it means you don't control the data you generate, and whoever controls that solution knows everything about you, about your economy, about everything that's going on. They can directly influence your country's future if you lack sovereignty in AI solution. If you don't have your own models, and if you don't store and process data on your own territory. The second technological trend is platformization. This is actually another very important trend, no less important than the emergence of artificial intelligence technologies. These are two trends that are deeply intertwined. This is, in essence, a shift in the organizational and managerial paradigm. Throughout its entire history, humanity has been on a path of automation. First, there was the long journey of automating the relationship between man and nature. That is, the automation of industrial technologies and agriculture. And we see how, in the wake of this automation, the employment structure changes, right? Before agriculture was automated, the vast majority of the planet's population, up until the 18th century, worked preciously in agriculture. Later, as the manufacturing industry developed and agriculture became automated, we saw the share of the global agricultural workforce feeding the whole planet go down. And now, this share is only a few percent versus almost 100 just several centuries ago. A small stage that covered several decades, somewhere in the end of the 20th century, was the automation of management. This is the so-called digitalization period, when management processes shifted from being somewhat intuitive and became reliant on data, on understanding of the true state of different elements of business. So management automation became a critical step forward. As a matter of fact, we're seeing a very important revolution taking place right now. We are transitioning from automation of relations between human and nature to the automation of relations between human and human. Automation of institutions, automation of transactions, and de facto a pivot from conventional market relations, a transition to a new way of organizing entire sectors of economy. What is this about? As we all know, the market that we're used to, the traditional market, is very ineffective and demanding, with extremely high transaction costs and a substantial information asymmetry. Business partners don't know each other very well, don't know much about their specific products, and it's hard to find the optimal contract parameters. This is why we invented firms. This is what Ronald Coase said in his famous study in the first half of the 20th century. He said that through self-organization and any firm, if you take any firm, it is certainly not purely a market relationship, but a rigid hierarchy-based entity with strict rules. And it is established with a view to reduce these transaction costs. In his works, Coase offered an example of a bakery and said that if Market and Adam Smith were right, and there is nothing more effective than the market, then any bakery would be self-organizing every morning. It would hire new bakers and search for new suppliers, because looking for new counterparties every day is the optimal thing from the market's perspective. But it is clear and perfectly understandable that the cost of this search is too high, which is why all standard supply contracts are usually made for the long term. All the staff work full-time, and only in this scenario the bakery will strike maximum efficiency. But for traditional businesses, the main issue is this green line right here. You see, as a business starts growing, its internal transaction costs begin to go up. It gets lawyers, accountants, financial departments. In other words, too much internal organization is required for an already complex company to start and continue to move forward effectively. The institutionalization level grows, and internal transaction costs for such a business start rising. So the bigger the company grows after a certain point, the more efficient it becomes. This is why, in order to survive, such companies strive to become monopolies and purse other understandable processes. A very important aspect is that digital platforms, because they are easily scalable, have no issues with the economy of scale. Even more, any digital platform gains maximum efficiency only when it covers 100% of the market. So, if we look at we all in Moscow today, so let's take a look at the platform-based taxi service. It is only efficient when everyone who wants to get from point A to point B in this country, in this city, is the client of this platform, and when all the drivers work for this platform. This enables the most effective distribution of drivers among clients, ensuring an effective supply-demand distribution throughout the city. How does it work? The larger an ecosystem becomes, the more users it attracts, the more data it collects, which makes its algorithms more accurate, improves its operational efficiency, reduces its costs, cuts its prices, and improves user experience. This attracts new users to the ecosystem, which then triggers this upward graph spiral. In fact, platforms grow due to the automation of market relations. Because in the past, if we look at the taxi industry, there were too many intermediaries represented by taxi companies, and we had inefficient mechanisms to determine the taxi fare. Because when you call a taxi, you are not aware of the traffic situation in the city, you don't know if the demand is high or low, and how many drivers are currently available. This essentially meant a very low workload for the drivers, so that the driver who wanted to work was standing idle most of the time. For example, we have statistics from Moscow, and before the platforms came in, as well as in the beginning, in the early stages of introducing the platforms, drivers were probably working no more than 30% of their workday. So once they got behind the wheel, they would only spend 30% of their work time actually driving passengers around. Today, the efficiency of these systems has reached 80–90%. This means that drivers can work as such as they want. If you want to work, you work, and all this time the system will send you offers from specific clients who need a taxi ride. This is how we're able to reduce many costs, and in this regard the platform economy clearly and significantly outscores traditional economy. What is very important, as I have already mentioned, all these trends and technologies are intertwined because the platforms are all built on a digital framework and their natural setting for the deployment of artificial intelligence. All the data is already in place. We have already prepared the data, and the deployment of artificial intelligence allows us to enhance the efficiency of such digital platforms, making them an even more effective form of industrial organization in today's world. As you can see, we have discussed logistics and taxi services, but sure enough platforms will gradually penetrate every area of our lives. There will be no domain where business will be organized traditionally and not as platform. The social services will be affected, and it has already affected trade and finance to a great extent. In fact, the biggest revolutions that are now gradually unraveling in the world are revolutions in healthcare and education. Platformization and AI can offer these spheres a brand new quality in terms of performance. If we go back to the first trend of geoeconomic change, a characteristic feature of platforms is the emergence of concept of digital feudalism. It was introduced by my Greek colleague Yanis Varoufakis. What does he say? He says that since platforms are starting to dominate and replace the entire market, there is a high potential for feudalism in relations between the owners and users of platforms. In other words, platform owners are starting to get infinite powers. This brings about certain risks, such as the risk of inequality and search for a new balance of relations within countries, risks of regulating platforms, taxing them, and protecting the rights of platform users. And of course, this affects country-to-country relations. In effect, we have now entered a stage in the 21st century when platforms attempt to colonize entire countries. For example, Western countries are trying to use their platforms to work directly with the users in other countries, while storing all the algorithms, methods, and data in their own territory. This is how they de facto collect a colonial fee for the use of their technology resource. And of course, in this case, we are also talking about sovereignty. As far as the platforms are concerned, there are three levels of sovereignty. Zero-level sovereignty is when you are totally dependent on foreign solutions and all data is stored outside of your country. So, for example, if your city relies on Uber for taxi services, then Uber can simply push one button and disrupt all logistics in your city if it wants to. As a result, you will no longer be able to organize effective logistics in the city. If user data is exported from your country, this becomes a security risk, because Uber knows who takes the taxi, from which place to which destination, and you don't own this data. It is owned by another country. Basic sovereignty in platform solutions is when you gain control over someone else's platform. What does this mean? This means that your data is localized and all your solutions are installed on local servers. This means you are not facing a risk of service shutdown by a push of a button. Still, in case of such a shutdown, you would get a frozen system that does not develop. And only the third level, advanced sovereignty, is the sovereignty to make your own decisions, to develop your own solutions. You own both the technologies and data. Advanced platform-based solutions have already been created in many areas in Russia, including finance, trade, healthcare, and a number of other domains. I have already talked about taxi. Yandex beat Uber in direct competition in Russia due to its effectiveness in the Russian market. Besides, Russia's approach to providing access to our platform solutions differs essentially from the approach used by the Western countries. In the West, these solutions are private property, but we always stick to the approach that Russia is ready to share its sovereignty and help other countries in the world become truly sovereign. We always allow data localization, and we are always ready to provide training to foreign specialists. We are happy to engage professionals from other countries to develop our platforms so they can later create similar solutions in their home markets. We understand that only joint development can help us build a world that is truly stable, safe, and actively developing. A world where everyone shares new technologies with each other, and preciously the world where anyone respects and helps each other to be sovereign. Only a world like this can pursue sustainable development. When one player tries to take advantage in technology or geopolitics, the result is always conflict and the situation that we see in the world today. As for the third technology, I will not talk about it at length because I already need to wrap up. Yet the third technology, which is just as important, is the autonomous systems that are also gradually penetrating our lives. And as I have said before, they are extremely important in the context of aging of the world. Self-driving vehicles, unnamed factories, anthropomorphic service robots, unmanned aerial systems. All these things will rapidly develop around us and will help make life on the planet sustainable in the face of population collapse and a shrinkage of working-age population. Megatrends will clearly shape many aspects of life. We've already covered how new connections are forming between countries and companies, including direct ties between BRICS nations and global majority countries. Yet platformization, AI, and autonomous solutions will have an especially profound effect on human development, work, and healthcare. Let me touch on that. Essentially, the same shifts will occur across the board. Platformization, leveraging all available data, AI integration, business process redesign, and building predictive models. This applies to education and human development overall. Education will evolve from traditional instructions to managing talent, fostering human potential and supporting lifelong growth, from preschool through continuous learning. We'll adopt a model where an individual profile, knowledge, and skills are transparently tracked on a platform, enabling personalized. Development paths, tailored courses, and a sharp reduction in exams. with the learning process continuously logged on the platform, and person's knowledge, profile and proficiency become evident, transforming the entire education system. This raises a crucial point. An excellent article from last year explores generative AI's impact on critical thinking, and I highly recommend it.
Очень интересная статья в прошлом году вышла, тоже рекомендую почитать. Это о влиянии генеративного искусственного интеллекта на критическое мышление.
It's a major challenge for today's society. In Russia, for instance, last year's data showed a steep decline in a smartphone AI assistant usage starting in summer. By June, key services saw a twofold drop.
Резко упала с наступлением лета. Наступил июнь, и там по ключевым сервисам мы увидели падение в 2 раза.
Why? Well, the primary users are school children who rely on phone-based AI for homework.
С удовольствием используют искусственный интеллект, который есть в смартфоне, для того, чтобы решать домашние задания.
They snap a photo of the assignment, and it generates the answer. Teachers initially countered this by rephrasing problems, but now AI solves any variation effortlessly, regardless of formulation.
Формированием новой задачи, то теперь искусственный интеллект спокойно на любую задачу, как бы она преподавателем не была бы сформулирована, легко находит ответ. Отношение
The new generation now treats AI like a teacher, placing and questioning trust in its outputs.
То есть идет история с безусловным доверием к тому результату, который выдается искусственным интеллектом.
And access is key. AI is now dubbed plug-in intelligence, offering ubiquitous access akin to electricity democratization, with constant availability of ready answers. Confidence in AI's response surges, while critical thinking skills plummet.
К готовому результату у тебя растет уверенность в ответе, который тебе дает искусственный интеллект, и резко падает твоя способность критически мыслить.
This erosion of critical thinking poses one of the biggest threats to education today. The system must adapt accordingly in this new era. Clearly, AI will permeate every facet of life, reshaping industries entirely.
Искусственный интеллект будет влиять на все сферы нашей жизни, менять то, как выглядят все отрасли. Ну и уже сейчас вот в этом же
The same study found that over 75% of people invest less time and effort in tasks with AI than without.
Искусственного интеллекта они тратят меньше сил и времени, чем без него. Это означает, что все процессы нашей жизни, ну, на самом деле, вы уже этого не замечаете.
These changes are subtle but pervasive. Urban security, ride-hailing, phone assistance are all powered by AI, which is here to stay and expand. Humanity's adaptation to life in this new world will require transformations not only in education, but also in the labor market. For example, here is Anthropic's 2026 assessment of which job areas are most likely to be automated.
Сферы работы будут автоматизироваться в большей степени.
It's crucial to understand that the current stage of AI implementation marks a fundamentally new phase. In the past, automation focused mainly on manual labor, gradually replacing physical work. Now, for the first time, technology is automating intellectual labor itself. This means the impact of automation will reach processes that are entirely different from those affected earlier, leading to a shift in the wage structure. In its basic forms, intelligence will be paid much less than it was before.
Это означает изменение структуры оплаты труда, то есть интеллект в базовом своем виде будет оплачиваться гораздо меньшей степени, чем он оплачивался до этого.
Let me illustrate this with an example. Recently, colleagues from the Russian music industry approached me, alarmed by the growing popularity of tracks created by artificial intelligence on music and streaming platforms. They asked, how will we earn money in this new world? How will we get paid for creating music, for composing new pieces, when AI can effortlessly generate new popular tracks from all our past work and that of our colleagues, often in better quality than human-made music? In fact, this is the erosion of the exclusivity of intellectual labor. We lived in an era wherein intellectual work was unique and consistently commanded the highest salaries. Now we can see that many fields, such as business and finance, management and legal services, are highly susceptible to automation and approaching full automation potential. Meanwhile, most forms of manual labor, by contrast, are far less affected by this wave of automation. This implies that income distribution will gradually shift away from the currently dominant sectors towards areas involving physical, hands-on work. As a result, society and the structure of the labor market will undergo significant transformations with profound implications from a labor market standpoint. I see Selena Neri in the room, and I've borrowed a bit from her approach, her diagram. This is not just about automatic industries themselves, but also about transforming the employment structure within companies and across sectors. The traditional classic pyramid has many employees at the base. Lots of newcomers who learn by solving problems, guided by mentors and moving up the career ladder to become mid-level staff and eventually leaders. The main challenge in the coming years will be that artificial intelligence starts eroding this pyramid from the bottom up. Entry-level roles, those filled by inexperienced people who make many mistakes, will become increasingly loss-making for companies and can, therefore, be easily replaced by AI. Previously, if you were, say, a researcher wanting to analyze the global knowledge base and the latest scientific papers, you would hire young specialists. They would read the papers, prepare brief summaries, and in doing so, they would develop their skills, including through interaction with you, to an AI service, and it quickly generates a summary, organizes the work, extracts the key knowledge, main conclusions, and references, and even builds a knowledge map for you. The same result is achieved much faster, more efficiently, and at lower cost. As a result, entry-level positions will disappear, while demand will grow for people who can work effectively with AI. But the key question is, how can you reach the level needed to work alongside AI if you no longer have those initial entry points? This implies that education system will have to produce not junior specialists, but mid-level specialists from the outset. This is, in fact, a major challenge for how the structure of the labor market will evolve. We all need to be prepared for this, not only the education system, but also corporations. The same dynamic applies in education and healthcare. Essentially, the same trend is unfolding everywhere, the introduction of AI-powered platforms and predictive systems. For example, let me briefly illustrate what is already happening in Moscow. Moscow is rolling out what is, in my view, one of the most advanced healthcare platforms in the world. Millions of Moscow residents regularly use the digital system, and their data is continuously stored and updated. What does artificial intelligence make possible here? It is integrated at every stage of the process. For instance, even though Moscow's clinics are equipped with MRI and CT scanners, There are no doctors sitting next to the machines. If you picture a typical clinic anywhere in the world, there is an MRI machine, the doctor invites you in, runs the scan, and that sits with you to analyze the images. In Moscow, this workflow is organized very differently. The scan is taken, but it is not interpreted on site. Instead, it is sent to a specialized imaging center where artificial intelligence takes the lead and handles most of the analysis. AI performs this task better than about 95% of doctors who might otherwise do it. And it does so at much larger scale. Suppose you took a scan, for example, to check for suspected rib fracture. The scan still contains rich information about the lungs and other organs. When AI analyzes that image, it does not focus only on the immediate issue. It examines all the data embedded in the scan at once. It's clear that this center employs highly qualified specialists. It's also clear that the center has a built-in quality control system designed so that human expert reviews the results produced by AI. At the same time, artificial intelligence checks the work of doctors, and through this continuous mutual verification, the overall efficiency of the system keeps improving. This represents a fundamentally new way of organizing care. Moreover, this platform can be easily applied, for example, to image analysis not only in Moscow but across our entire country, but is already widely used. In principle, any image analyzed anywhere in the world, in any country, could become part of this image analyzer system. It can function as a separate component of the Moscow healthcare platform, or it can work with AI process that more broadly. First and foremost, this always supports doctors in making diagnoses. Artificial intelligence can analyze the full scope of medical data across all patients and draws on far more information from the individual profile than a doctor could easily recall. When a person comes in with a specific complaint, the system can analyze what they say. This is where speech recognition comes in. For example, automatically recording and structuring the conversation between doctor and patient. Combined with all the other data, this allows for much more accurate diagnosis, delivered much faster, and it can also suggest which additional tests are needed to fully clarify the clinical picture. Moreover, such a system can operate in a predictive mode. What does that mean? For example, last year in Moscow, a risk zone analysis was carried out using a comprehensive set of medical data for Moscow residents, and from 100,000 to 1,500,000 people at high risk of stroke or heart attack over the next 12 months were identified. Instead of waiting for someone to have a heart attack, then dispatching an ambulance, incurring high costs, and causing the loss of the person's ability to work and quality of life, the healthcare system began acting proactively. Doctors from clinics started calling these individuals, offering checkups and monitoring their condition, which has significantly reduced a number of ambulances calls in Moscow because they started intervening early with people at risk of a stroke within the next 2 to 3 months, preserving the ability to work and preventing many deaths. As a result, enormous opportunities are emerging through the use of artificial intelligence platform technology. Yes, some of what we've discussed today may sound alarming, but at the same time, the potential of these new technological solutions to improve quality of life is, in fact, virtually limitless. I'm confident that together, working both in Russia and in your countries through the introduction of new technological solutions, deeper connectivity between our nations, and joint projects, we will be able to create the greatest possible positive impact on people's lives in our countries and on our planet as a whole. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. We'll see each other tomorrow on the final review. Goodbye.